how video games can improve brain functioning and treat mental illnesses. Sophia Vinogradov, University of California, San Francisco.
When the wall came down, I thought about my Russian grandfather, who had fought against communism during the Russian Civil War and had lived the rest of his life in exile. How happy and excited he would have been to hear the news.
Hello. Welcome to the world of John Rutledge. John believes that these pigeons are wizards come from another planet to tell him that he is the second Buddha. At night, he sleeps in a doorway. During the day, he looks for food in garbage cans. Most of the day, he's plagued by voices inside of his head from the pigeons, from evil spirits. John has schizophrenia, a serious mental illness that affects about 1% of the population worldwide. He refuses treatment. If you came across him on the street screaming at the voices in his head, I bet you'd be frightened. I bet that you would actually cross to the other side of the street to avoid him. You would see so clearly that he's out of touch with reality. What you would not see is that John was once a talented young journalist who won a prize for his work on the Special Olympics. You also would not see that he was once a beloved child. Today, in 2013, we know that serious mental illnesses such as schizophrenia are caused by dysfunction in brain information processing networks. These connections among brain cells are what allow us to think, to feel, to remember, to interact with others. In schizophrenia, the brain networks that are involved in auditory information processing are particularly dysfunctional, and it's related to the auditory hallucinations, the voices that they hear. We also know that the brain processing for social information, such as faces and emotions, is also impaired. We also know something else, which is that serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia, is a progression, a trajectory with symptoms changing over time. When someone is a young child, there usually are not any detectable symptoms. It's not until they become an adolescent or a young adult that early mild symptoms might start to emerge. For example, in John's case, he began to think that aliens from other planets might be interested in his work. These kinds of mild symptoms often go on for a few years before the person seeks treatment, sees a doctor. That's when we make the diagnosis. And then, and only then, do we offer treatment. And the treatments might work or might not work, or the person might refuse treatment, and in that case, we enter a period of chronic mental illness. Only a few decades ago, people who had serious mental illness were locked away behind walls of psychiatric hospitals for the rest of their lives. Today, we still lock people with mental illness behind walls, only now they are invisible walls of stigma, of fear, of isolation, and of hopelessness. And yet, to lock people away behind these walls is to deprive ourselves of their gifts. Over the course of history, humans with various mental illnesses have made incredible contributions to us as actors, as politicians, as scientists, as artists, and even as our loved ones. Have any of you here ever loved somebody with a mental illness? I have. It's my cousin Anne, right there. She, as a young lawyer, was one of the first people to write about legal ramifications of sexual slavery. Now, a few decades later, because of her manic depressive illness or bipolar illness, it's very hard for her to get out of bed in the morning, and she can no longer work, even though she's taking 4 different medications. And this leads me to a very sobering fact today in 2013, and that is that the treatment for serious mental illness has essentially not changed for the past half a century. Let me say that again. The treatment of mental illness has essentially not changed for 50 years, and that's despite all of the new science that we have. We can treat the troubling symptoms with medications for hallucinations, for depression, but medications touch every single cell in the body and often cause problematic side effects. We can also use talking therapy or psychotherapy, but it's expensive, it takes time, you have to have a trained therapist, it's not available for everyone. Neither medications nor talking therapy directly target what we now know from the science to be the malfunctional or dysfunctioning brain networks that characterize mental illness. But how are we going to change brain networks? How are we going to get the brain to work differently, to work in a more healthy fashion? Well, the answer might surprise you. We are going to become London taxi drivers, okay? You're going to do that with me. We're going to learn to drive that funny black automobile, and we're going to learn to drive on the left side of the road, and it's going to be a lot of fun and very exciting. But then we have to learn something else. We have to learn this, right? What is this? It's the map of London. And if you're going to become a London taxi driver, you have to study this map for 2 years and take lots and lots of tests and show that you've mastered all of this complicated information. Well, you know what happens? It turns out that our brain changes when we become London taxi drivers. And in a seminal study conducted in 2000, a group of British researchers showed that the brain changes and grows. The part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is important in navigation, actually changes size in men who become London taxi drivers. This was the first study to show that intensive training will change the brain. This is what we call brain plasticity. Now, for many years, past decade or so, scientists and psychiatrists thought, well, brain plasticity is only going to work in healthy brains. It's not going to work in the brain of someone who has a serious mental illness. But a few years ago, working with a basic scientist named Mike Merznick, I decided to take a hammer to that wall. I decided to challenge the idea that the brain and mental illness could not change. This is the wall we were going to attack. We decided to come up with brain training exercises to target some of the dysfunction that we knew happened in the brain in schizophrenia, just like you might come up with weight training exercises to help people grow bigger muscles. Our idea was that if we could make the brain work better, this would help with some of the serious symptoms, the hallucinations, the social dysfunction, and that would help with the disability. We decided to focus on brain training exercises that would target the auditory system and that would also target social information processing. The idea was that this would help people become better in touch with reality, what we know is the problem in schizophrenia. So, of course, we wanted to first understand how impaired, what were the problems in reality monitoring in our patients before we started the training. And reality monitoring is the idea that the brain must be able to make the distinction between what's happening inside the mind and what's happening in the outside world. So you're going to be one of my research subjects, and we're going to do one of our reality monitoring tests that we would do with our subjects before they start the training to see the level of impairment. So all right, so play along with me here. The dog chased the cat. Great. So you made up that word. It came out of your own mind, right? Great. So we record that. All right? Now this, the sailor sailed the sea. Great. In this one, you didn't make it up. I showed it to you. You don't have any trouble with that, right? You can tell what you're making up in your own mind and what's happening out there, what you're perceiving. Someone with schizophrenia has difficulty with this process. So we test people's reality monitoring, and then we have our patients come to our clinic in San Francisco, and they do the training on the computer, and they do it 5 days a week for about 4 months. I'd like to show you an example of an exercise which focuses on the ability to distinguish between sounds that are going up in pitch and sounds that are going down in pitch. This is something which is difficult for people with schizophrenia, and to play the exercise, which looks like a video game, you have to choose up or down arrow. Oops. Can we get the video here? Yeah, here we go. Before I show you this next exercise, let me tell you a little bit about the young man who you just saw playing. His name is Brandon. He's a student of mine, came from Berkeley, and while he was working with us, he happened to develop symptoms of schizophrenia. He began to think that his computer was talking to him, and he thought his family was trying to kill him. One evening, he became so violent that his family had to call the police, and he was hospitalized. He got treatment, and then he did the brain training exercises, and I'm happy to say today he's back to normal. He won a scientific award. He's a paid research assistant now. Let's look at another exercise of the type that Brandon and others might have played. This one is focusing on social information processing. You're going to see a face, and then you have to select the same face from a group of 4. Great. So you do that, you do your 4 months of training, but now we need to show, has your brain changed? Have we improved your reality monitoring? So to do this, we take you to the brain scanner, and you come into the scanner, and we continue our assessment of your reality monitoring abilities. So I show you dog, cat. Now, was cat a word that you made up inside your own mind? Yes. Okay, now I show you sailor sea. And was sea something you read, or did you read it, or did you make it up? You read it. This is pretty easy. Very easy for you to remember that distinction. If you have schizophrenia, and I show you dog, cat, it's not so easy. You make mistakes. You think that cat actually was shown to you in the outside world. Now, when we look at the brain activation patterns, because when you're in the brain scanner, we can take pictures of your brain, what we see is activation, if you're a healthy person, in the front part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. This is what allows you to make distinctions between internal mind and outside world. If you have schizophrenia, before you've begun any brain training, we see an abnormal pattern of activation in this posterior or back part of the brain, and you have trouble doing the reality monitoring. You can't tell the difference between inside your mind and the outside world. But after 4 months of brain training exercises, something very interesting starts to happen. We see more normal brain network activations in the patients. What went from the abnormal rear activation, the back part of the brain, we now see more normal activation in the front part of the brain. We also see better reality monitoring performance. And both of these changes in the brain are related to better social functioning 6 months later. That is, people who've done the training 6 months later, the patients, are interacting more with their friends and going out and doing more activities in the real world. Now that's interesting. These were people who had been ill with schizophrenia for 20 years. But what if we were able to intervene earlier, before someone had been ill for 20 years with the illness? I had told you that schizophrenia is a progression. What if we could do it in that early, high-risk period when someone is only in late adolescence or early adulthood, before they've lost their friends, before they've had to drop out of school, before they've been hospitalized? We actually are doing research now on people who are 20 years old who are just having those first early mild signs. We're giving them laptop computers so they can do the training at home. They don't even need to come into the clinic anymore. It's the idea that they're not going to be seen as ill, they're going to be seen as people who are doing some brain training to strengthen their brain. And what we're beginning to see in our early initial results is that indeed, after the training, people's symptoms are going back down. Their functioning is improving. For the first time, raising the very real possibility that we might be actually targeting recovery in the illness, recovery in the brain networks, and indeed perhaps even prevention or cure. I would like to posit to you today that on November 9th, 2013, we now have the knowledge and technology to break down the invisible walls of fear and stigma and isolation and hopelessness that have surrounded mental illness. Indeed, I also have some research that's just starting up where we're looking at the use of interactive software, of the internet, and of mobile devices to bring this kind of brain training exercises to young people across. Right now, we're looking at 3 different continents. The idea is to create treatments that are accessible, that are scalable, that are not too expensive, that can help the brain improve, and that can also create at the same time communities of encouragement and support. When I asked Brandon what had helped him get better, he said, you know, the brain training exercises helped, but it was also the love and compassion that you surrounded me with. Let's do it. You can join in breaking down this wall as well. I promised them that I would go over time because he hasn't had enough work yet, and he's getting a little bored sitting in that chair. So I will get to give you my last line, which is, we can do it. We can change the course of mental illness. Just think of the gifts that are waiting for us. Thank you.